In Chapter 10 of his autobiography, Sounds from Another Room, former UK Air Marshal Sir Peter Horsley described his interest in unidentified flying objects. This began when serving as equerry to Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, and a London close encounter with an alien named Janus in 1954. What follows is an assembly of video documentation on these events. As you watch, please remember from the ancient Sumerian clay that the kingship descended.
In the mid-1950s, the Duke of Edinburgh began taking a keen interest in the subject of UFOs. Fortunately for him, his personal equerry, Sir Peter Horsley, was also a high-ranking military man who had access to some remarkable contacts and astonishing information.
He was at one time investigating UFO reports in the main operations centre at the Ministry of Defence as part of his duties, and he gave some of these reports to the Duke of Edinburgh.
Knowing how the household works, if Prince Philip wanted some information, the natural chap to ask would have been his equerry. And so he may have said to Peter Horsley, find out what you can about these UFOs, for heaven's sake. I keep reading about them, which he would then have done. He did have an interest in this. I wouldn't say it was a consuming one or a permanent one, but he asked one or two questions, which of course got prominence really out of proportion to their actual worth, simply because he was the Duke of Edinburgh.
Horsley, in his role as Deputy Chief of Strike Command, had his finger on the clear trigger. One day a colleague by the name of General Martin telephoned him and asked him to go to the Chelsea home of a curious woman by the name of Mrs. Markham. She was playing host to a Mr. Janus, a man who had something of the utmost importance that needed to be discussed with Horsley in person. Intrigued, he left the palace on a wet and misty night, taking a path that was to lead to an extraordinary encounter.
As he thought it might have something to do with the royal family, he went. And he was sitting in this flat, which was apparently a well-furnished, quite nice flat in a good address, when in came a chap whom he'd never seen before in his life. He was not by any means inquisitive, but he was a very keen, intelligent man, and he and Horsley had a very interesting talk.
Their conversation covered UFOs and atomic warfare.
He made it clear to Horsley that he knew a great deal of things which Horsley knew, but which were secret, perhaps even top secret.
Janus's knowledge sent a shiver down Horsley's spine.
He knew all Britain's nuclear secrets at that time. So obviously he found this very disturbing, and the first thing he did was to report it to Buckingham Palace when he went back to the palace.
When the Duke heard about the case, the strange encounter was considered to be a security risk. Horsley was immediately dispatched to the house in Chelsea to question Janus again.
When he went back to the address, it had become quite different, not at all what he'd seen on the night in question.
The room had been vacated apparently. He could not find the person with whom he'd been at the meeting. And of course the guy from elsewhere had disappeared as well. So it remained a mystery, but it was very disturbing for him.
This was an astounding experience, related by a man whose integrity is beyond question.
For Horsley, the most chilling aspect of the encounter was the feeling that Mr. Janus was reading his mind. This led the royal equerry to a startling conclusion.
Horsley had said that the man was, no question about it, an alien. He believed implicitly that he'd had this encounter. I can assure you that he would not have recorded it if it were not so. By no means would he have made up such a story. He would have been frightened of being ridiculed.
Horsley later recounted the story in his autobiography, written shortly before his death, but the government file on the incident remains classified and unavailable to the public.
In the 1960s, Sir Peter Horsley carried out his own private investigation.
I didn't believe or disbelieve in them. I was just inquiring into them. I was inquiring into them because there were an awful lot of reports around at the time, and because they were aircrew, I suppose, pilots and what have you.
As an RAF fighter pilot who eventually rose to the rank of Air Marshal at the Ministry of Defense, Peter Horsley was in a unique position to know whether the UFO phenomenon has any substance to it. Early in his career, when he was a young worker at Buckingham Palace, he became interested in UFOs.
I was working in the palace at the time, and we all discussed it. Prince Philip, General Browning, we all discussed it, sometimes jokingly, sometimes quite seriously. And I think Prince Philip was very open-minded about the whole subject. And I suggested one day that I should do a little research into it. He was absolutely fine. He said, don't bring any adverse publicity on the palace, obviously. Don't become a crank about it. Go ahead, inquire into it. The Fighter Command rang me up and said, we have a case here with a crew of a vampire night fighter who've seen an unidentified flying object flying right over them. And I then went to Westmoreland, spoke to the station commander, and he introduced me to these two. And they said they were at 20,000 feet. They saw this object approaching. It was circular, it had bright lights around it, and it went over the top of them at a vast speed, at about 1,000 miles an hour. And when I got back, I checked up, and the radar picked it up as well. There were many reports.